Pleasant day to all. I am Norma JC Hinaroso, and together with my co-reporters, we will discuss the topic of communicative competence, language functions, interactional competence, and discourse analysis. So now, let us proceed to communicative competence. So, communicative competence is a construct that has been the subject of interest in the early 1970s, at which time language practitioners and even researchers began to see too much emphasis on the structural and the cognitive trends of 1950s and 1960s. So in the 1970s, a distinction was made between linguistic and communicative competence to highlight the difference between knowledge about the language forms and abilities that enables a person to communicate functionally and interactively. Mundada and Dollar stated that if interactional activities are the fundamental organizational tissue of learners' experience, then their competence that cannot be defined in purely individual terms as a series of potentialities located in the mind or in the brain of a lone individual. Also, Zungler and Cole in 2005 asserted that the concept of language socialization in SLA or second language acquisition is of paramount importance in research L2 learning. Also, in Watson, in Gigeo, and Nelson in 2003, they agreed saying that it stands to contribute the most in understanding of the cognitive, cultural, social, and political complexity of language learning. So now, let us proceed to defining communicative competence. So the term communicative competence or CC was coined by social linguist Delheims in 1972, who asserted that Chomsky's notion of competence was too limited. Also, Chomsky's rule governed creativity that so adopted describe a child mastering grammar at the age of 3 or 4. The word competence or linguistic competence was first used by Chomsky in 1965 to refer the language of knowledge as different from performances, which he sees as the actual use of language. So also in Chomsky's opinion, the linguistic competence is the ability to understand, repeat, and produce new utterances. Chomsky introduces the idea of linguistic performance. So the linguistic performance is a use of language in a concrete situation. Delheim, however, pointed out that the linguistic competence could not explain the actual rules of use. He highlighted that this competence is not enough to explain a native speaker's knowledge for this reason. He developed the theory of communicative competence. So, according to Himes, a language user needs to use the language not only correctly, based on the linguistic competence, but also appropriately and based on communicative competence. So, also Himes referred the communicative competence or CC as that aspect of our competence that enable us to convey and interpret message and to negotiate meanings interpersonally within a specific context. Sanders Savignon in 1983 followed a decade later with the claim that communicative competence is reliable, not absolute, and depends on the cooperation of all the participants involved. So in the process of examining the components of communicative competence or what we call the CC, James Cummins in 1979 to 1980 proposed a distinction between basic interpersonal communicative skills or what we call BICS and the cognitive academic language proficiency. Let us proceed now to the basic interpersonal communicative skills. This is the communicative capacity that all human beings use to function in daily interpersonal exchanges. So the BICS is the language that we use for friendly exchanges, often with peers, informal settings, and involving more slangs and conversational metaphor. So here are some examples of the basic interpersonal communicative skills or what we call BICS. BICS. Hey dude, what's up? Not much. And you? I'm good. Well, my boyfriend is like, you know, I mean, he's all I do know. What? OMG, are you serious? Lol, but wait, I'm Lemon now. See you. As you can observe, that the example that I was given are involving more slangs and conversational metaphor. And as you can see that the above examples of the basic interpersonal communicative skills, or what we call BICS, requires some context to understand what the speaker is saying. Cognitive Academic Language Proficiency, or CALP, is a specialized dimension of communication used to negotiate a typical education task and activities. Often involves a conscious focus on language forms. So CALP typically involves language use in both comprehension and production modes. For such as, here are some examples of CALP. To manage classrooms, everyone be seated. Get into small groups and discuss this question. What page did you ask us to look at? To convey information through academic prose, the following research methodology was used to examine the three hypotheses. To frame the test questions according to the reading passage, do you feel John is A, guilty, or B, innocent? Or choose A or B. To engage in classroom discourse, I see your point, but I think. So, a comments later, 1981, modified the notion of the BICS and CALP in the context-embedded and context-reduced communication. So, the example above are a good share of a face-to-face communication with people because of its social back and forth. It is a context-embedded, while school-oriented language tends to be more context-reduced. Another model of communicative competence was presented by the two Canadian applied linguists Michael Connelly and Merrill Swain in 1980 in the first issue of Applied Linguistics. So in the theory of language acquisition and the theory of language testing gave their valuable contribution to the further development of the concept of communicative competence. So Connelly and Swain understood the communicative competence as a synthesis of an underlying system of knowledge and skill needed for communication. They divided the communicative competence into four different components or subcategories made up the construct of communicative competence. So, the first two subcategories reflected the use of the linguistic system itself, the grammatical competence, and the discourse competence, while the last two defined the functional aspects of communication, which is the social linguistics competence and strategic competence. So let us proceed now to the Connelly and Swain's framework. So first, the grammatical competence. It is the knowledge of lexical items and rules of morphology, syntax, sentence grammar, and semantics. Also, the phonology. It is the competence that we associate with the mastering the linguistic code of language. The competence referred to by Himes in 1972 and Polston 1947. So basically, the grammatical competence involves knowing the form of utterances to be used, such as pronunciations and grammar, and it is the ability to create a grammatically utterances. Second, the discourse competence. It is the ability to connect sentence and structures of discourse and to form a meaningful whole out of series of utterances. With its interstitial relationship, the discourse encompasses everything from simple spoken conversation to lengthy written text like articles, books, and etc. So in simple words, it refers to the way ideas are linked across sentences in a written or in spoken. It also means that knowing how to interpret the larger context and knowing how to construct written and spoken language of different genres such as narrative text, procedural text, expository text, descriptive text, and persuasive text. And the third one, the social linguistic competence, so it is the ability to follow sociocultural rules of language. So this type of competence requires an understanding of the social context in which language is used. So the role of the participants, the information they share, and the function of the interaction. So the last is the strategic competence. It is the ability to use verbal and non-verbal communicative techniques to compensate for breakdowns in or communication or insufficient competence. So it also includes the ability to make repairs and to sustain the communication through paraphrase, circumlocution, repetition, avoidance, and guessing. Later modification of communicative models. So one promising version of communicative competence was offered by Lyle Bachman in 1990, who proposed a resimplification of Canali and Swain's in 1980, model under an overarching mode, language competence or a language ability. So let us define first what is organizational competence. It is the rules and the system that govern what we can do with the forms of language, whether they be sentence level or what we know a grammatical rules or rules that specify how we string sentence together or discourse. So, pragmatic known as a functional aspects of language. Canali and Swain's social linguistic competence was divided into two separations, the elocutionary competence and the social linguistic competence. So let's first define what is elocutionary competence. It is pertaining to sending and receiving intended meanings, while the social linguistic deals with such consideration as politeness, formality, metaphor, register, and culturally related aspects of language. The final recent framework or model of communicative competence reviewed here is the one presented by William Littlewood in 2011. He also takes Canali and Swain's in 1980 as Canali's 1983 model as the initial model and develops it by adding a fifth component as well as the adapting the terminology. William Littlewood 2011 provided yet another conceptualization of communicative competence using the 5 separate dimensions, mostly rearrangement of Canali and Swain's and Bachman's definition. So the 3 competence are borrowed from the previous concepts such as the linguistics, discourse, and social linguistic with virtually no redefinition. So Littlewood also added pragmatic competence as a separate node, the ability to use linguistic resources to convey and interpret meanings in real situations. Sociocultural also is added to include cultural knowledge and assumption that affect the exchange of meanings. Lastly, the table 8.1 that represents the model of communicative competence compared. So in Canali and Swain's 1980, it has 4 parts: the grammatical, discourse, social linguistic, and strategic competence. While in Bachman 1990, a language competence with strategic competence as an executive function, the organizational competence that it has 2 parts that includes grammatical and textual discourse, and the pragmatic competence which has elocutionary competence or a function of language and a social linguistic. And lastly, by Littlewood in 2011, it has 5 subcategories: the linguistics or grammatical, the discourse or textual, pragmatic or strategic, and social linguistic and socio-cultural. So the goal of communicative competence is the ability to use the language correctly and appropriately to accomplish communication goals. The desired outcome of the language learning process is the ability to communicate competently, not the ability to use the language exactly as a native speaker does. And that's all. Thank you for watching.